All right, it's 12:02, so I'm going to get started here. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's science seminar with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. My name is Jess Del Fiacco. I'm the communications manager here at the Midwest CASC. I'm going to start us off with a couple housekeeping notes. As it says on the screen, this is going to be recorded and posted publicly on our YouTube channel. So please keep yourself muted and off camera if you would like during Allie's presentation. Once we get to the Q&A portion at the end, we'll invite everybody to come on camera if they'd like and ask their questions directly. Speaking of the Q&A, we will have dedicated time for that at the end of Allie's presentation. But if you would like, if a question comes up, feel free to pop it in the chat while she's presenting and we'll get to it at the end. I am gonna flip slides here. As I said, we're the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. If you are new to these science seminars, I want to give a quick intro to who we are and what we do. The Midwest CASC is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of universities and other institutions in the Midwest, which you can see on this map on the slide there. And we work to produce science that helps inform natural resource management efforts to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. Some of the ways that we go about that work include supporting a large network of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows who are pursuing climate adaptation research at these different institutions. We host workshops, events like these seminars, and other opportunities for folks to learn from each other and hone research skills. The CASC Consortium, pursues synthesis research projects on topics that are relevant to important research priorities in the region. And of course, through the Midwest CASC, the U.S. Geological Survey funds climate adaptation research projects. And we work to support those projects and partnerships as the consortium. A couple quick announcements before we get into the main event here. We work closely with our federal colleagues to do all the work that I just talked about, and we are very happy to welcome them back into the office after the shutdown the last few weeks. So I just wanted to wish them a quick, warm welcome back. And then the next one here, mark your calendars for January 12th. The Midwest CASC is going to host a community of practice meeting. It's going to be focused on maladaptation. If you'd like to learn more, you can head to the Community of Practice page on our website. I think Sarah just popped that link in the chat. Has more details about what that meeting is about, what our Community of Practice is, and how you can join us there. It'll be open to everybody. With that, I am excited to hand things over to Allie Scott, who is the Deputy Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the Midwest CASC, based at the College of Menominee Nations Sustainable Development Institute. Allie, I am going to pull my slides down here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Jess. Are my slides up and can you see them okay? Awesome. I'm getting some thumbs up. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really nice to be with you all. So my name is Allie Scott. I am the Midwest CASC Deputy Tribal Resilience Liaison. Really excited to be here to share with all of you about what I'm learning about wildlife range shifts and tribal lands. I do want to start out right from the beginning and just point out that I am not an Indigenous person. So I was born in Atlanta, raised in Virginia, and I've lived in Wisconsin for the last 7 years. I'm also a wildlife biologist by training. And the information and the perspectives that I'm going to share with you today come from my work in a professional capacity. So I work with the Tribal Resilience Liaison Program, but I am an outsider. I have a limited perspective. I don't represent or speak on behalf of any tribe. And the knowledge and the perspectives I'm sharing today have been graciously shared with me from many different people over the course of my work. So I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that learning and growing and coming together with all of these kind of information is a group effort. And so I appreciate just the network that the Midwest CASC is and all the partners that we work with in our region. And so, if you aren't familiar with the Tribal Resilience Liaison program, my colleague Sarah Smith and I work really closely together as the liaisons for the Midwest region, and we support climate adaptation and resilience among tribal nations throughout our region. So, we work to make sure that tribal climate science needs are reflected in the activities of the Midwest CASC, and also that the great work that's coming out of the CASC is reaching tribes and being useful to them. And so we are employed through the College of Menominee Nation, which is a consortium member of the Midwest CASC. And CMN is also a tribal college, so it is chartered by the Menominee people, and it's located on the Menominee Reservation. There are actually 37 tribal colleges and universities throughout the United States. We have 8 of them here in the Midwest, which is pretty exciting because that means that we have more than 20% of the nation's tribal colleges and universities here in our region. And they're hosted in our region by a variety of tribes, so including White Earth, Red Lake, Leech Lake, Lakota, Kenowa Bay, Bay Mills, Saginaw, Chippewa, and then, of course, at Menominee. And I also want to point out that on average, tribal colleges and universities provide the most affordable college tuition in the nation. So they actually play a really significant role in making a college education more accessible in some areas where there might be a lot of different barriers to pursuing higher education. And so they're pretty important in the communities where they are. If you want to learn more about that, you can visit the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC, whose map I borrowed here. And I just wanted to take the chance to highlight that a little bit because I know that TCUs have been in the news a little bit more lately, and people in this audience might be curious in learning a little bit more about that. And so I mentioned we work with tribal nations in our region. So here in the Midwest region, we have 36 federally recognized sovereign tribal nations. We have even more that are not federally recognized. And these tribes span many different language and cultural groups, including Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Meskwaki, Mohican, Munsee, Odawa, Ojibwe, Oneida, Potawatomi, and others. I point this out to highlight that tribal nations in our region are really quite diverse. A lot of people, especially if you work in fish or wildlife in our region, you work in the Upper Great Lakes, you may be familiar with GLFWC, or Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. They're part of the Midwest CASC Consortium. They do a lot of awesome work with 11 federally recognized Ojibwe tribes in our region, so we have some close collaborators there. But GLFWC isn't everybody. There's a lot of different tribes in our region from lots and lots of different groups and backgrounds. And I also want to highlight that every tribe has a different story. So they have many different treaties with the US government, many different histories of removal. And so I think a really good example of this is you'll see that I added a red star to this map in northern Illinois. And so in 2024, the Prairie Band of Potawatomi became the only federally recognized tribal nation in Illinois. And if you were able to attend the annual, or not the annual gathering, but we had a summer symposium this year for the Midwest CASC. If you were able to attend that earlier this year, you would have had the chance to hear from the tribal chairman who shared more about the history and how that tribe was actually removed from lands illegally. They had lands that they had never actually ceded to the US government, and that was only finally restored last year. So I think this is a really good example of how the story that every tribe in this region has is unique and different. And it can get really complicated. So you can't generalize across all these different groups. And with that, today we're talking about wildlife range shifts and tribal lands, and we really can't talk about tribal lands without also talking about treaties. So this is a map of the continental United States and of lands that were ceded to the United States through treaties with sovereign tribal nations. And if you're not familiar with Native Land Digital, I did put a link there in the corner. That's a really great resource where you can go and explore with these maps in an interactive way. But if we zoom in here to the Midwest and to our region for the Midwest CASC, you'll see that all of the lands within our Midwest CASC footprint were ceded through treaties with tribes. So even if you don't live or work somewhere where there's a tribe present today, because as the last map I showed, it had some of the states in our Midwest CASC region weren't actually colored in. So even if you live in one of those states, the place where you live and work has cultural, spiritual, and ancestral importance to people who are still alive today. But their ancestors were removed from that land. And so I just want to emphasize that all of us who are living or working with cultural and natural resources here in the Midwest have the potential for tribal engagement. And I also want to take the opportunity just to address some common misconceptions about treaties with tribes. So something that I'll hear people just kind of say in conversation is, oh, well, tribes, they got special rights, or they were able to get special rights from the government. The US government gave them rights. And that's not actually true. So tribal treaties do not give rights to tribes. They actually reserve rights that tribes already had. and that they did not give up when they ceded land. So we talked about how tribes are sovereign nations. These are rights that are inherent to them, and their treaties specify the terms of their land cessations and other negotiations with the US government. And one of the things that treaties do give are rights to the United States. And something that's relevant to all of us is that tribal treaties give you the right to live here. They give me the right to live here. And so tribal treaties aren't just relevant for tribal nations. They are relevant for all of us who live and work here because they are what give us the ability to live and work in this region. And so I'm going to pivot for a moment and I'm going to talk more about climate change impacts in this region. I know that this audience is probably already pretty familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I did want to highlight just some of the signals we're seeing of climate change in our region. One of those is warmer and shorter winters. So we're seeing that winter temperatures are warmer on average. The winter season isn't lasting as long as it used to. We have snow on the ground for a shorter part of the year, not getting as much snow. We don't have ice cover on our lakes for as long as we used to. So this is a really strong signal of climate change in our region. Another one that we're seeing are altered patterns of precipitation and drought. So getting maybe heavier rainfall events at times of year that weren't really normal in the past, having different times of year where we're getting droughts lasting a little bit longer, it's not as predictable. The alterations between these different conditions maybe aren't as predictable as they used to be in the past. So we're seeing a lot of change with that. We're also starting to see more frequent and intense extreme weather events. So we're having extreme weather events that are happening more often. When they do happen, they have the potential to be more severe than might have been normal in the past. I think an example of this that I can relate to is I live in southern Wisconsin in Ho-Chunk territory, and last year in February we had a tornado, which was pretty significant, not usual for that time of year. And so we're starting to see that kind of thing happening more often. And then also disruptions to our seasonal changes. So one of the things that I really like about living in this region is that we have all four seasons and they're really prominent. But the signals and the transitions between those seasons are starting to look a little bit different than the way that they did in the past. They're happening at different times of year. Sometimes we're seeing that those shoulder seasons are starting to shorten, where maybe it feels like we are going directly from winter into summer and we maybe kind of skip spring, or maybe spring looks a little different than the way it used to. So all of these things together are some of the main signals of climate change in our region. And what I think is really interesting is that here in the Midwest and around the world, we're seeing that wildlife are already responding to climate change. So they're already responding to these impacts. And there are some common examples of this. So one of those is changing phenology. So phenology is the timing of life cycle events in plants and animals. And we're seeing that they're adjusting the timing of these life cycle events in response to these changing conditions. So one really common example of this is that songbirds are starting to breed earlier in the spring. They're shifting that date where they're having their nests earlier in the year as it's getting warmer and as the conditions are adjusting. Another example of this are changes in behavior. So I know that we don't have American pikas in our region. I think this figure is adorable and it's also really helpful for illustrating this concept. And you'll see that the pika in the top photo is puffed up. It has its legs tucked in. It's trying to stay warm in a cold environment. And the pika in the bottom photo is stretched out. It has its legs stretched out from under it. Its fur is laid down more flat. And so it's trying to shed heat and stay cool in a warm environment. And we're seeing that wildlife are using their behavior to thermoregulate. So they will do this to try to maintain an optimal body temperature. And we're seeing that some species are adjusting the amount of time they spend doing a thermoregulation activity or seeking out different conditions that are going to help them thermoregulate and making trade-offs with other activities. And so this is something that's happening among lots of different species. We're also seeing changing morphology. So there are species now throughout the world that are starting to have proportionally smaller body sizes and larger appendages, which I think is really interesting. So if you have larger appendages and a smaller body size, it's actually easier for you to shed heat and maintain that optimum body temperature. And this is really going beyond Allen's rule, where we're seeing that gradient across latitudes. So we're starting to see this shift in response to the climate among many different species. And then finally, the signal and the response that I'm going to talk about for the rest of our time today are range shifts. So this idea that species are adjusting where they exist in space as they're tracking the optimal conditions that are shifting across the world. And so when we talk about wildlife range shifts, a range is the geographical area where a species occurs. You can see in this map on the right that this is the distributional range of moose in North America, which I'll refer to as Turtle Island in this talk. And ranges of species are not static, so they can shift over time in response to many different changes. That could be changes in resource availability, so as their basic needs like food, water, shelter, or space shift where they're available on the landscape, species will shift to track those things. They can shift in response to changing environmental conditions. So they might be tracking optimal conditions like temperature or moisture levels. And so species need to exist where those environmental conditions are suitable. And then they also might shift in response to their relationships or interactions with other beings who live nearby. This can be things like predation or competition, mutualism, all kinds of reasons why a species may or may not exist in a certain space relative to where other species are on the landscape. And multiple different drivers can play a role in these range shifts as they happen across the landscape. And so this can be things like human land use change, which are adjusting where species can exist. It could be things like species invasions, kind of going back into that idea of interactions with other beings. Things like disease can really shape this. Natural disturbances sometimes they may alter what's suitable for a species and maybe make it so it's no longer viable for a species to be there, or maybe it opens up a new area where a species can enter. And also climate change. So we know that climate change creates a lot of different conditions and makes a lot of different changes that can adjust where species can exist on the landscape. And what I think is really interesting about this is that these different drivers can interact with each other and they can exacerbate each other. If I was going to borrow language from the US Department of Defense, they actually say that climate change is a threat multiplier. I think that that is kind of an interesting way to think about the fact that climate change in particular really can exacerbate all of these different things, change the way that they play out, and result in some really unique situations that are driving range shifts for lots and lots of different beings. And so we know that globally there are many different species that are shifting their ranges. Some of the directions that this is happening that we've expected to see are that they're shifting toward the poles or they're shifting upward in elevation as they're tracking those optimal temperatures. For our aquatic species, many of those are shifting deeper in depth as the top parts of the water column are what are warming faster, and so they're going to shift deeper in the water column to track those temperatures. But what we also know is that species shift at different rates. Some of this is because different species have different abilities to move on the landscape. Species may have different opportunities to move based on what's available. And we know that not all species are shifting in expected directions or at the expected rate. This is in part because of the types of interactions I mentioned previously, where it's complicated. There's lots of different drivers that can interact to influence the way that range shifts actually play out. And the kind of upshot of all of this is that ecosystems do not generally move as intact units. And what this means is that familiar assemblages of plants and animals, instead of tracking climate conditions together and shifting across the landscape, they're actually being separated as they're responding differently to the pressures that are driving these potential range shifts. So for here in our region in the Great Lakes, we are seeing that there are northern beings that are declining and that are disappearing as their ranges are retracting to the north. And there are southern beings that are appearing and that are increasing as their ranges are expanding up from the south. And climate change is interacting with other stressors, so things like land use change, to drive these shifts that are happening across the landscape. If we zoom in a little more, this is a map of the homeland of the Menominee people. And so you can see the light gray line of the state of Wisconsin in the background. To the north is Lake Superior, and to the east is Lake Michigan. And there have been Menominees here within the boundary of this black line, as long as there have been people here. So we're talking about thousands of years, or effectively since time immemorial. And Menominee people have always coped with changes in their environment, and this is a requirement for maintaining a long-term relationships with a specific place, is being resilient to those changes and able to adapt and respond so that you're able to persist. I did include the College of Menominee Nation logo on the top right because this includes images of the five principal clan animals of the Menominee tribe. So if you've ever wondered what was in our logo, that those are the five principal clan animals. And the image below I included, this was designed by one of our interns at the Sustainable Development Institute, and it includes the names of these different beings in the Menominee language, which I thought would be really nice to include here too. And so we have black bear, sandhill crane, gray wolf, golden eagle, and moose. And all of these beings lived alongside the Menominee people in this territory. And so this is the present day range of black bears, and you can see that there's a pretty significant overlap with that Menominee territory. This is the present day range, consolidated across breeding and non-breeding range, but this is range for sandhill crane. This is the modern day range for gray wolf. So we know that gray wolves were historically extirpated from this region. They have naturally recolonized and they are recovering in the state. And so that is their overlap with the Menominee homeland today. This is the modern day range of golden eagle. And then finally, we also see that there's overlap with present day range for moose. And all of these beings lived alongside the Menominee people in their ancestral territory. Their specific abundances or specific range limits may have fluctuated throughout time, but Menominees could move throughout this territory to maintain relationships with these different beings as these changes were taking place on the landscape. And I also want to emphasize that these beings are relatives, so they're not resources. They have tremendous cultural, spiritual, subsistence, and economic importance that goes beyond Western concepts of species existing as resources. So these are relatives, these are beings. What's interesting is that today the Menominee Reservation occupies just a fraction of this ancestral territory. It is the largest reservation for a Native American tribe that is east of the Mississippi River. And Menominees are unique in that they're one of few tribes that were never removed from their ancestral homeland. And they actually did have to fight to stay here. So the US government tried to remove them west of the Mississippi River to Minnesota and beyond. They were able to negotiate to secure a reservation within their ancestral territory that's within about 60 miles of their creation story. So this is a big deal that they were able to stay here. But this reduction in territory also means that today the Menominee tribe does not live alongside moose, which is one of its clan animals. And I want to emphasize that there were likely moose in this region in the past, throughout this region. So we're used to thinking of the map on the left as the kind of quote natural range of moose, but this likely reflects somewhat of a retraction from their previous extent in relatively recent history. So southernmost records for moose in the state of Wisconsin actually go back to the 1840s, as recently as the 1840s. And I just want to point out that the Menominee were signing treaties and ceding lands with the US in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. So this would have been a period of a lot of landscape change as settlement came in and started converting land. But it also would have meant that in 1854, when the reservation was created, there would have likely been moose ranging throughout at least a lot of this territory. So I don't know that Menominees were necessarily choosing to live in a territory that did not have moose. Um, and to put this in context, I want to show that this is the range of moose across the entire continent of Turtle Island. So in the Menominee homeland, which you can see in the black outline that's still there in the state of Wisconsin, you can see that moose do reach the southern extent of their continental range. So this is a southern range limit for moose. And you'll notice that moose are found throughout northern regions, and this is because they are extremely well adapted to cold environments. So they have really long legs, and this allows them to walk through deep snow and keep their body cavity up out of the snow, so they're able to stay warm that way. They have really thick fur that is able to insulate them from cold temperatures. They can eat and subsist on woody browse in the winter when green vegetation isn't available from the trees and it's inaccessible due to snow cover. So they're really well suited to living in these cold environments. But it's really easy for us to draw these nice crisp lines on maps to show range limits. And we know that moose are not evenly distributed throughout this range. And especially at their range limits, there's a lot of variability in individual populations. So here in Wisconsin, where I'm coming from today, we know that moose are no longer considered to have self-sustaining populations in the state. They're not actively managed in the state, and when they are sighted within Wisconsin, they've usually traveled in from neighboring populations in adjacent states. We also know that in Minnesota, moose used to be found throughout the northwestern and northeastern portions of the state. The northwestern population has actually declined pretty substantially in the last few decades, and it is no longer considered to be viable in the long term. The northeastern population has declined pretty significantly from its previous numbers. In the last decade or so, it's been relatively stable. Those numbers seem to no longer be in a state of decline. But we have seen a pretty significant reduction in the number of moose that are existing in those populations. And then in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we know that moose populations recently have been relatively stable in small numbers. There's been some active management intervention. This population's monitored a lot. They are pretty small populations. And in general, the projections for moose in our region, it's not great news for the long term. And so this means that today we know that someone from the Menominee Reservation would have to travel pretty much out of state if they wanted to visit a moose population today. And in the future, if moose continue to decline in this way, they may need to travel across international borders up into Canada to get to the nearest moose population. And there's a lot of different reasons why moose at their southern range limit here in the Great Lakes region are struggling. One of those is winter ticks. So we know that warmer winters are allowing greater numbers of ticks to survive over the winter. They cause pretty significant hair loss for moose, which they actually end up, trying to rub. They're irritated. They lose that hair. It increases their exposure to the cold and can lead to hypothermia. They're also struggling from pretty significant blood loss from tick loads and can end up with severe anemia, which I think is pretty shocking to think about for an animal as large as a moose. We also know that moose are really susceptible to heat stress, and I think that this seems intuitive when we think about unusually warm days in the summer, but they're also vulnerable to this when we have unusually warm days in the winter. And so moose, they get overheated. This is really physiologically stressful, and it decreases their overall ability to survive. We also know that moose are experiencing elevated levels of disease. This is also because milder winters are allowing, believe it or not, there's greater numbers of deer that are persisting in regions where there are moose because winters aren't as cold and as harsh as they used to be, which usually can help to kind of keep moose and deer separate from each other. And these deer are carrying diseases that are pretty difficult for moose to live with and cope with that can be pretty deadly to moose. So we're seeing elevated levels of disease in moose. Throughout moose territory, we're also seeing declining habitat quality. So there are ecosystem changes from human land use change, from climate change. This reduces available habitat for moose and just makes it harder for them to meet their basic needs. And so when moose are unable to find adequate food, water, shelter, they're going to be more physiologically stressed. It's going to be harder for them to survive, especially when they're coping with some of these other stressors. And similarly, moose that are already struggling from elevated levels of illness, elevated levels of malnutrition, they're going to be more vulnerable to predators. So it's harder for them to defend themselves when they're dealing with all of these different challenges. And if we take all of these things and accumulate them together, what we end up with are kind of sad, sick, vulnerable moose that are really struggling to persist at their southern range limit. And all of these stressors are related to climate change and specifically to warming winters. I want to highlight that there are other tribes in the Great Lakes region that also have spiritual, cultural, economic, and subsistence relationships with moose. And so as moose range is shifting north, some tribes are becoming separated from this relative, and this is putting these relationships in jeopardy and affecting tribal lifeways. I'm going to pivot a little bit to further illustrate this concept. So this range map should look familiar because it is very similar to the one for moose. But this is the continental range of snowshoe hare on Turtle Island. And snowshoe hares are another cold-adapted being that are extremely reliant on seasonal snow cover to survive. So their name snowshoe hare refers to their large back, fluffy feet that allow them to move easily across the top of the snowpack. But they're also extremely specialized to snow cover because they undergo a seasonal coat color change to blend in with their environment. And so in the summer, snowshoe hares are brown, as you can see in the photo on the left, but in the winter, they molt to white to match a snow-covered background, which you can see in the photo on the right. This is a really important survival strategy for snowshoe hares. They, as I like to call them, are the Snickers bar of the forest. Everybody wants to eat a snowshoe hare, and they play a really important role in the ecosystem as a prey species. The way they're able to tolerate such high levels and interest in predation on them is the fact that they're able to blend in with their environment enough to offset that predation pressure so that their populations can survive and persist and be viable. Notably, the trigger for coat color change, so the signal that tells them it's time to shed my brown coat and switch to a white coat, it's not temperature and it's not the presence of snow. So the trigger for snowshoe hare molt is actually the shortening days of winter. And this means that as days get shorter each winter, snowshoe hares are molting to white around the same time each year. And they're doing this even if there's no snow cover on the ground. This can and does result in mismatched hairs. You can see in this photo that this is a white hare on a brown background, and it is extremely difficult for a mismatched hare to survive because it's extremely visible to predators. So not only are we not blending in with our background, but we're actually standing out from the background in a way that is the equivalent of going onto a battlefield with a flashlight, not a thing you want to do. And this makes it really, really difficult for snowshoe hares to survive. So earlier we talked about how one of the signals of climate change in our region is these warmer and shorter winters. And so this means that decreases in the extent and duration of winter snow cover in our region are a huge concern for snowshoe hares. And so here in our region, similar to moose, we know that snowshoe hares reach the southern extent of their range throughout the Menominee homeland. And in present-day Wisconsin, the historic range boundary for snowshoe hare followed a transition between two forest types. So we have northern hardwood forests in the north. This is where we get really persistent seasonal snow cover. Southern hardwood forests in the south, an ecological tension zone going between these two ecosystems. And so in the early 1900s, we had a lot of settlement, a lot of people moving in, and they were rapidly converting forest habitat to agriculture. And with this, the range of snowshoe hare receded north of this historic boundary in response to those recent habitat changes. There were field surveys done in 1980 that found that the range boundary was still responding to habitat changes, so some areas were continuing to recede north due to ongoing agricultural conversion. Other areas were actually expanding and recovering a little bit as the forest was recovering. But we also have data going back that shows that since about the 1970s, southern populations of snowshoe hare have been in a state of long-term decline. And field surveys that were conducted in 2014 showed that the range of snowshoe hare had receded even farther north. And what's notable about this is that this contraction occurred despite the fact that land cover change was minimal during this period of decline. And so this means that land cover is no longer driving the decline of snowshoe hares. And instead, the primary driver for range contraction today is climate change, and specifically warming winters with loss of snow cover with increased camouflage mismatch. And so snowshoe hare populations really cannot survive without adequate snow cover throughout the winter season. And so this is the trend through time. And we know, papers have estimated that snowshoe hare range in Wisconsin is contracting at a rate of about 5.4 miles per decade. And so given that this data is about 10 years old now, we can likely draw this line even farther north. I want you to notice how in blue, the Menominee Reservation is sitting on the edge of the 2014 range boundary. And so this means that the potential loss of snowshoe hares from the Menominee Reservation is imminent. And again, it's not only Menominees who are affected. So there are multiple tribes in the Great Lakes region that have spiritual, cultural, economic, and subsistence relationships with snowshoe hare. And I'm going to borrow this quote from Eric Clark that I think really speaks to the importance of this issue for tribes in our region. And so Eric said that resource managers are constantly putting species in the winner or loser bin. In general, just saying, well, snowshoe hares are a climate loser, so we're going to start thinking about cottontail rabbits instead. That's not an option. It's not the cottontail rabbit that's littered throughout Anishinaabe creation stories. It's snowshoe hare. It's waboos. And I think this point is also emphasized when we talk about moose. So it's not my place to talk about specific details about Menominee clans, but I do want to point out that in addition to the moose clan, Menominees have subclans for elk and for white-tailed deer. And so these are different groups with different responsibilities and different teachings. And even though these are all ungulates in our region, they're not interchangeable species as far as culture is concerned. And you can learn more about that directly from the source if you visit the Menominee Clan's website, which I have linked there on the slide. And so this brings me to my first take-home point for this talk, which is that the identity of beings in an ecosystem matters. So living beings are relatives, they're not resources. And this means that, like family members, species who are lost cannot be replaced. And you might say, well, Allie, there is some good news. Neither moose or snowshoe hare are in danger of extinction. Their populations are stable globally. They're actually doing quite well in some other parts of their range. And so we know these species, they're not really going to be lost. And I think that that is fair. It's great news that moose and snowshoe hare are not in danger of extinction. But there is an important element of this when we're talking about tribal nations, tribal lands, which is that for many indigenous peoples, the loss of local access to a culturally or significant plant or animal is comparable to that species becoming extinct, if I'm to borrow a quote from Dr. Kyle White. And so I underlined local access to emphasize that even though these species are not extinct, and even though they exist in stable populations elsewhere, they're no longer locally available to the people who have relationships with them. And so there have been Menominees in this region as long as there have been people in this region. They've lived alongside their non-human relatives for thousands of years. And even though the Menominee Reservation is located within their ancestral territory, some of their relatives are being lost from this place, which is fundamentally changing what it means to live here. And so Menominees were able to avoid being removed. But what does it mean if their homeland changes out from under them? And this brings me to my second take-home point for this talk, which is that the location of beings on the landscape matters. Tribal treaty rights are fixed in place within static jurisdictions, and this means that tribes cannot relocate to maintain relationships with species who move away, even when they possess treaty rights to continue ways of life that are associated with those beings. And so, speaking of location, I did want to highlight that we didn't talk about the other side of the coin when it comes to wildlife range shifts, which is the appearance of southern species. So, I focused on northern species moving away, but we also know that southern species are moving in. And so as winters grow milder, we are seeing increases in the abundances of some cold intolerant species as they're expanding their ranges northward. One example of this is the Virginia opossum or possums, which have been expanding their range due to land use change and climate change over about the last 150 years. You can see in this map that I pulled from a paper that the range of possums has been expanding from the southeast up into the northern Midwest. And especially in recent decades, there have started being accounts of them spreading into Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, where we didn't used to have them. And just talking to people anecdotally up on the Menominee Reservation, people are seeing them up there for the first time. So this is a species that is moving into that area. Believe it or not, this is also happening with nine-banded armadillos. So those who live in the more southern parts of the Midwest CASC region are probably already familiar with this. But this is a figure from a paper published earlier this year that documents verified accounts of armadillos in the continental US. And you can see that they are making their way north. So this is a species that used to exist primarily in the southeast and along the Gulf Coast, and they are spreading up through the Midwest. It's probably going to be a while before we have breeding populations of armadillos in Wisconsin, but we do have dispersing individuals that are effectively knocking at our doorstep. I mean, if you look at this map, and there are accounts at the northern state lines for Illinois, for Indiana, for Iowa, basically knocking at the door for Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So they are definitely on the way. And I also just want to point out that what we call a southern species is relative, right? So this is an image from northern Alaska, and up there, moose and snowshoe hare are actually expanding their ranges northward. This is corresponding to fundamental shifts in ecosystems that are occurring in that region as the climate changes. They're seeing losses in their northern species, so species like caribou and others are starting to decline in certain areas. And I bring this up just to point out that it depends on where we're talking about which species is northern, which species is southern, who's declining, who's increasing, and all of this is relative to the specific places that we're focusing on. This kind of brings me to my third take-home point, which is that the way we treat range-shifting beings matters. So range-shifting species are someone's relative, and it brings up this question, how are we going to treat them when they arrive? This is something that I've heard from people as we've had conversations about this issue and the way that it's affecting tribal nations. People are wondering, how are people going to treat our relatives when they move away from us and they move into northern areas? And the same thing, how are we going to treat other people's relatives when they move into our region? Are we prepared to live with them in a good way? And I think that the terminology that we use when we talk about range shifting species really can demonstrate some of these underlying values. So Are range-shifting species invasive species? Are we going to treat them the way that we treat invasive species management? Are they non-local beings? So they're doing their best to survive. It's not really their fault that they're moving, and so we're gonna tolerate and maybe accept them. Are they migrants? Are they refugees who are escaping a climate change situation? I bring up all these terms just to illustrate that ecosystems have never been static, but we are moving into unprecedented territory when it comes to rapid environmental change and these associated range shifts. So, as we're working to protect and conserve individual locations, individual species, or populations, we really can't lose sight of the regional and the global processes that are at work. And so, these are my three take-home points for today, which is that the identity of beings in an ecosystem matters. The location of beings on the landscape matters, and the way we treat range-shifting beings matters. I think it's well established in the climate adaptation field that moving with the climate may help species survive. And I actually hear biologists talk about this sometimes on presentations about range shifts, where they'll say things like, we want them to move with the climate, we want them to track these changing conditions. And this is in part because research is often focusing on facilitating these range shifts to prevent extinctions. We don't want species to go extinct, so how can we help them move to track these conditions? It's also focused on understanding these ecological community changes and mismatches so we can better understand the processes and the dynamics that are at work. And ultimately, some of this knowledge is used to triage which populations we're going to protect and support. And I think sometimes this is acknowledging the reality that resources might be limited. There's limited capacity, there's limited staff time, there's limited funding. So which populations are we going to work really actively on, and are there others that we're going to unfortunately have to let go? But I think what's often overlooked is the way that range shifts can disrupt these place-based relationships. And in particular, I think research can overlook the impacts of local extirpations. And so many of you in the Midwest CASC community are already familiar with the RAD framework for responding to the impacts of climate change. So this idea of resisting, accepting, or directing changes, where we might try to resist the changes that climate change is bringing to an area and try to maintain the way it is existing or in the past. We might accept these changes and accept that they're going to happen and allow them to progress. We might intervene in a more active way where we're going to try to direct these changes and shape what the future looks like. And so when we're making these decisions about which course of action to take, I think it's very common for managers to consider things like time or money, effort or capacity. All of these things are really important when it comes to making these trade-offs. But I think what might be overlooked and that also merits attention are some other important considerations. So things like treaty rights. Are there sovereign tribal nations with treaty rights to maintain a certain way of life associated with certain beings here? Identity and not just function. So who are the people living here? What are the specific species and ecological communities that are impacted? Things like location. So what's the fundamental attributes of this place? How do range shifts play a role in this? And our intentions. So how are we going to treat range shifting beings? What are our goals and our priorities for future conditions? And what trade-offs are we willing to make? And those trade-offs play a really big role in determining our course of action when we're responding to wildlife range shifts. So we can intervene to try to keep them here. We can do things like protecting their habitats. We can try to reduce stressors other than climate change to give them the best shot at persisting. We can intervene to help them move. So maybe this is things like increasing habitat connectivity. We could physically move them through things like assisted migration or managed relocation. We can observe and learn from species that are affected by climate change and that might be shifting their ranges. So seeing what they're teaching us from their responses. Or maybe this is getting ready for new neighbors. So if armadillos are coming into our region, they dig a lot of holes. I know that they can change the way ecosystems work in some places. And so are we prepared for when these new relatives move in? And then I think there's an opportunity to share and listen with people who live north and south of us. So are there things we can learn from people who live south of us about the beings that we're expecting to move into our region? Are there ways that we can build relationships with people who live north of us so that we can maintain relationships with beings that are leaving our region but will still be present up there? And so, as we're navigating these decisions, I think we are repeatedly confronted with a question like, what does it mean to live and work in the Midwest? Or if you're tuning in from a different region, what does it mean to live and work where you live and work? Tribes are sovereign nations with treaty rights and specific cultural, spiritual, economic, and subsistence relationships with wildlife and other beings. But these issues affect all of us. So we all have certain attachments and ways of life associated with these places, and these changes are going to have impacts for all of us. I really like this term solastalgia, which I think is really useful for describing these kinds of dynamics. This is the homesickness we feel while still at home, and it's usually applied specifically to talk about the distress caused by environmental change. So this is the grief you feel when your homeland changes out from under you. I think that this is something that's relevant for tribes in our region, and I think that this is something that's relevant for all of us in our region. The way that we're going to respond to these changes matters. I think that the decisions that we make should be transparent in acknowledging the trade-offs that we're choosing as we navigate this. And even though we have an uncertain future ahead of us, I think we also have a lot of influence in shaping what that future is going to look like. So that's it for me today, Macklin. Thank you so much for listening to me. If there are any questions or discussion, I'm happy to spend some time on that if we have time. And otherwise, that is my contact information, and you're welcome to reach out. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Allie. That was a great presentation. I'm so happy that you spent this time with us today. We are going to open it up, as Allie said, to your questions. I am actually going to stop our recording for this